I was this close getting ready to dunk on McFarlane again for diving back into that well of Dark Knight's metal, but officially, it's kind of true, kind of not. This is technically Batman from Dark Knights of Steel, and it's basically an Elseworld comic storyline in which the lamest term of it is, what if your favorite DC characters were in medieval fantasy? That's pretty much what that is, and that's pretty much what this Batman is. Pretty much, what if Batman was in fact a knight of the round table? I know, like I said, I'm oversimplifying it, but this is pretty much this brand new iteration of McFarlane Batman figure that we recently got in terms of recent releases. And overall, you can see that McFarlane is definitely within their wheelhouse, definitely within their comfort zone as far as design, interpretation, portrayal, sculpting, because this is what McFarlane is always striving to do. Things that are cool, man. Things that are totally looking cool. That's my Todd McFarlane impression. But here's the thing, is that when it comes to Batman, and when it comes to anything that has to do with chainmail, swords, plates of armor, McFarlane is like a kid in a candy store, and that's pretty much what this Batman is going to do, especially when it comes to the things that it's definitely able to excel at. But much like that kid in the candy store, there are still going to be some flubs that, like a kid, they're very difficult to learn from. And it looks like this is maybe a figure that I have a theory about. And that theory is going to be that this is essentially a figure that they probably had in the blueprints for the longest time, and now finally that they've caught up on an awful lot of releases, that they probably had some kind of contract or some kind of obligation with WB, like the six-pack, different movie tie-ins, Aquaman stuff, Blue Beetle stuff. They finally got around to making this guy, and they pumped it out. And albeit it looks pretty cool. You can see right here that the suit of armor, the actual lifting of the cloth material, and the way that the overall concept and design for a knight Batman, not a Dark Knight, but rather a knight-hooded Batman, can look like, it definitely fits the bill as far as exactly carrying on over the tropes that you would obviously see with Batman, specifically the helmet that is now designed to look like a cowl, and the actual sculpting of the ears, and along with the little plates that are guarding the mouthpiece, actually look pretty nice. And the actual paint applications, I kind of wish that there was something about the eyes that would have been whited out as opposed to actually having pupils. I don't know what it is, but there's something about the design of this cowl that I think would have benefited better from whited out eyes. And if I'm not mistaken, that's actually kind of more or less how he looks like in the comics, so I don't know why exactly they didn't opt for that here. But the rest of the suit is definitely sculpted very well in terms of the actual plates of armor, the ones on his shoulders, on his chest, on his abdomen, and then, of course, like I said, always playing to their strengths, McFarlane was able to nail the little straps that are holding the waist together, the blue, the muted blue underneath, the cloth, and then the gauntlets themselves. Of course, it's all going to look pretty immaculate and pretty neat. But much like McFarlane has done so in the past, this is kind of where we get into some nitpicks here, or some legitimate complaints, depending on who you're asking. There's always something that feels kind of missing when it comes to suits of armor and plates such as this, especially when you know that McFarlane has done weathering and kind of like battle damage applications to pieces of armor like this, especially when you take into consideration the Spawn line. The Spawn line is pretty famous for being able to encapsulate so many different little details of weathering and battle damage, especially to the spawns that are supposed to be modeled after like medieval armor and things like that, especially, you know, when you take into account the Hell's Army that are lifted from there. So I kind of wish that they would have done so here, but kind of keeping with tradition, McFarlane kind of skimps out a little bit on the extra paint apps that would have benefited a Batman such as this, especially when you can take a closer look and see that you do have gouges and scratches on the armor to kind of signify that he has seen battle. But to really take into account that they could have added an extra little bit of paint application to really bring it home and make it come alive, it's a wasted opportunity. Sure, this is going to appease an awful lot of people that like to do custom jobs on their figures, but that's just them. For people who don't really like to do that, or don't really favor that, or have the time, you know, it kind of feels like a wasted opportunity. It feels even stranger when you take into consideration the actual manufacturing of said plates and said armor, because an awful lot of these armorized pieces, they're not really hard plastic, they're more like this rubberized plastic that kind of flushes and flexes, which does have a form of functionality that I'll get to in a second when I start to move the figure about, but it does kind of break the immersion just a little bit, especially when I've seen other McFarlane figures, whether they were Batman or, like I said before, Spawn, have pieces of armor that are a little bit more rigid and feel a little bit more alive and premium. Here, everything is kind of rubberized, and so it kind of makes me think of Arkham Knight, where he had all those plates of armor, that tactical armor, but then when you touch the pieces, they're very flippy and flappy. So it seems like we kind of have a similar thing going on right here, and it gets even worse when you take into consideration the cloth, specifically this little kind of skirt design that has, like I mentioned before, a little bit of weathering, especially with the holes kind of ridged out and damaged throughout here, kind of ripping and tearing. And it gets even worse when you take into consideration the so-called cape, or I'll go ahead and call it the cloak, if you will, that's draping from the back. I like that the sheath for the sword is poking through it. That's a nice little detail that makes the whole thing look a little bit more innovative, but once you actually feel the cape in hand, it's made out of that very flimsy kind of rubberized, well, rubber, really. It's not even that much plastic. It's more like this much cheaper rubber that I've seen on some other Batman capes, and therefore it doesn't really strike quality. So, like I mentioned before, it feels like this is a product of like 2021, early 2022 McFarlane, when they were kind of pumping these things out like, oh, what would be like a cool looking Batman? And they kind of shelved this for a little while, especially when they were catching up an awful lot of the DC stuff, the Flash, like I said before, Blue Beetle, Aquaman, and now finally we get this guy. And if that wasn't already kind of a testament to it, the articulation definitely hammers that across even better. Because if you couldn't already tell, the outfit is not going to be doing too many favors for some points of articulation, and then others are being made out of these joints that I've really never seen in a really long time. Again, harkening back to that older 2021, early 2022 stage of McFarlane. The head itself is technically able to rotate at a 360-degree angle. However, it's a little finicky when you start to delve towards this side, which is ironic because even though it's not anatomically correct to be able to turn the head 360, technically the neck is anatomically correct because it's kind of at a slant instead of directly upwards. So even though it's supposed to look natural, it doesn't really do too many favors when it comes to head rotation except for the far left and far right, and very good tilting towards the bottom, but not so much towards the top. He can actually barely even look up, so it's a little stagnated in that sense. When you get to shoulders, you are able to rotate them vertically 360 degrees, as well as slightly extend them towards the sides. Just mind the shoulder guards that are technically able to flex, especially because, like I said before, they are made out of that rubberized plastic or that rubberized piece of material, because even though it's able to flex and does lend to the extension, it kind of cheapens out on a little bit of the quality for those armor pieces. And then there's a little bit of shifting on the butterfly joint, but not as good as some other McFarlanes. It's kind of moving just a little bit on the ball joint or on the rod piece inside, but it's a little stagnated, it's a little stiff, so it may vary on your figure depending on how flexible it ends up being because of the washer that's a little rigid inside of that shoulder piece there. And then we get to, again, a joint that I have not seen in a really long time, like Ben Kenobi said. You have a bicep swivel that's actually a clean horizontal cut, and I understand why they did it because of the shoulder guard here. So the compromise, I am definitely welcome to it. It's just, like I said, strange. It's a very strange observation to have this. And again, it kind of lends to my theory that this is a shelved project. I could be wrong. I'm definitely open to being wrong, but I just can't shake that notion off. And the bicep swivel is in fact one of those products because it's able to fully rotate 360, but you'll notice right there that it's an even cut right underneath the shoulder guard. Beyond that though, you do have the two joints of the elbow that are fully able to bend all the way up, and then the wrist joint, which is unfortunately just a static ball joint that is able to rotate horizontally 360 as well as move inwards and outwards, but mind the gauntlet a little bit because it is able to limit the mobility slightly being in the way. Then we get to the torso joints, or I should say joint, because this is where we start to transition into limited mobility. You do have a mid-torso cut right underneath this top plate that is able to allow it to move left and right. In fact, it can rotate the full 360, as you can see right there, and it is slightly able to crunch upwards and downwards. You can see right there is a little bit of mobility happening right there. Not too much towards the back, but definitely good towards the front, which is quite ironic considering this huge armor chest plate, and slight crunching side to side, and that's really kind of about the gist of it. No real waist articulation. It kind of feels like it's buried somewhere in there, but because of the way that this skirt is designed, it's kind of contracting everything together. And likewise, you can guess where I'm going with this. The top leg joints are a little bit on the limited side. Extending towards the front is actually pretty good, but it starts to get a little stiff and slow when you get to about that angle right there. No real mobility towards the back except for some slight extension there. And then when you get to extension towards the sides to do the splits, it kind of stops right at about right there before you start to see just a little bit of tearing and weathering happening on the rubberized skirt piece, especially right here in this little middle cut. So do be careful with that, because you're not going to be able to do full extensions like other McFarlanes. Granted, you very seldom are going to be able to pose this guy like that, because he is, after all, meant to be in a full suit of armor. Thankfully, things get a little better when you get to the knees, because you do have the two joints there that are actually a little bit on the rotated side and are fully able to bend all the way up right there. Just mind the skirt piece. Then we get to the ankles, where again, leading me to believe that this is an older project that got pushed off to the side and finally released. You have basic ball joints for the ankles, so you don't have that flush, vertical, cylindrical joint that I really like that feels much more natural to the body. You sadly only get the ball joints, so you can definitely still pivot the ankles downwards and upwards like so, as far as the shin guards can allow it, and rotation towards the sides are actually pretty good, almost the full 360 right there, and are rotated. You just got to mind the little bit of pivoting that you could find yourself doing so when you're kind of inclining the ankle like so. But mobility is still good. It's not really that limited. It's just that, again, it's that ball joint that thankfully is being covered up by the guard. So at least there is that. But it, again, going back to my theory, seeing that it's the older joints doesn't do it any favors. You do, however, have the toe joints that are fully able to bend all the way up right about right there. So if you do have some problems with posability, they can lend to that. But you can see right here that this is not necessarily meant to be the most agile and flexible of the recent releases of Batman. And sure, you can toss that up to that being kind of like a lore thing because of the fact that he is a knighted out Batman with a full suit of armor, but then again, there's little characteristics here and there that lead me to believe that this is, in fact, an older project that definitely has presence. That's the one thing that I won't take away from this guy, is that he has an abundance of presence with the way that his armor is designed, and it's able to be sculpted up by McFarlane, because this is, again, their wheelhouse. But there are definitely going to be some compromises that at the time they couldn't really fully engineer, and since then they've come a long way. But I don't see that awfully reflected here. Same could be said for the sword accessory. Now, I will admit it's actually pretty neat how well sheathed it is over here in the back, and I do like the design choice to have the sheath kind of cut through the cape. It makes it much more practical for him to have it on person, and plus it's really good to see that I'm always a sucker for McFarlane Batman that allow me to store the accessories on the person of the figure. That way it's not just kind of tossed to the side or it has to go back into the box. I love it when I'm able to adorn the figure with said accessory. Now, the sheath itself, even though it does a really serviceable job of keeping the sword in place and cutting through here, and like I said, kind of cutting back on the real estate that it's taking up on the back by piercing through the cape, much like the cape itself, it's made out of this rubbery, very bendable material that makes me just a little nervous that the sheath itself is not going to really protect the sword as well as it could inside of the lower itself. But it's kind of neat that you can still technically store it. Once you actually remove it, you then have the, what I like to call pretty much the Batman Buster Sword, because it's pretty much an elongated kind of Claymore style sword, and the actual design of the sword itself is actually pretty neat. I do appreciate the golden hilt here with the little kind of divots and sculpting that's going alongside the little hilt guards right here, as well as the handle itself. It's all pretty well intricately designed, as well as the chrome paint on the blade itself. But similar to what I was arguing about before, the actual material made out of the rubber that makes the sword is very bendable. I will admit it's a bit more formidable than that of the cape or the sheath, but I still wish that we could have maybe reinforced the blade to be a bit much more firmer, especially since, like I said, since then we've had several different accessories that feel a bit more quality in hand. Now, once you're able to move past that, however, you are able to fit the sword in either hand, but what I like to do is basically take it and put it in both hands so that when you do, you get this. And this is basically the compelling argument that this Batman figure does, is that he has presence. Once you fit the sword into both of his hands so that he's wielding it dual hand style, and kind of like I said, a Buster Sword, he definitely is able to, the sword itself is at least able to accomplish the image, which is to actually deliver on what it would look like if Batman was a knight from the times of Arthur, from the medieval times. And so when you're able to kind of compose it all together and put him in the right pose, he definitely sells the image, the shelf presence that he has, especially when you take into account the little details that McFarlane is known for: pieces of armor, capes, tethered straps, things like that. The very rustic feeling things that they've definitely perfected during their times with Spawn since the 90s and things like that. So you see an awful lot of that DNA shared with this Dark Knights of Steel Batman, but there's still little quirks here and there that make me think, still hold on to the theory that this was a shelved project and they finally had the time to pump it out there. And because of that, I would say that this is one of those Batman figures that if you are in fact going for that complete McFarlane Toys Batman collection, kind of what I'm aspiring to do at the very least, then this is definitely worthy of being in your collection. And I would definitely argue that this guy will look even more badass standing next to those Elseworld type of McFarlane Batman figures like the Gladiator Batman or any of the Dark Knight's Metal Batman with the very leathery, spiky coats and the black leather and straps and everything going on like that, especially the one with the red guitar. This guy would definitely fit at home up on the shelf next to those figures, most especially Joker Dragon. He probably fits the bill as far as complementary figures that would definitely sell the image and look very cool up on the shelf. But if you're not doing anything like that, I can definitely not blame you for wanting to pass up on this guy. If you feel like this is mainly a FOMO buy, then maybe wait for some kind of sale, some kind of clearance, and then he would probably fit that price points just a little better considering what you're getting, especially because now we've gone so far as the little techniques they've done with sculpting and with articulation and joints and specific things that I've seen them do better. And so to see Dark Knights of Steel Batman that definitely is a looker kind of fall back on those trappings, it's just a little bit of a bummer. And it compels me to give Dark Knights of Steel Batman a 7 out of 10. He's still a pretty good figure, but unless you're going for that complete collection of McFarlane Batman, I wouldn't necessarily blame you if you were to pass him up on the peg. But if you still nevertheless want to pick up your own, there are going to be affiliate links in the description for both Amazon and Entertainment Earth if you guys want to do so and help out the channel in the process. Aside from that, I do have a question for you guys. What's a figure, whether it be for McFarlane, Marvel Legends, or any other toy brand that is out there, that is part of your collection that feels and looks better being in that collection rather than by himself? Like, if it wasn't for that collection, you probably wouldn't have picked that figure up. And while you're down there, hit the thumbs up button if you did enjoy this video, hit the thumbs down if you did not, and as always, stay humble. I'll see you guys later.